Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of a. I'm going to see if I can bring up a picture of Moses Austin. Probably can't see that well, but that's okay. A little bit of an orientation to the Torget book. What Torget is interested in is how Texas transformed from a very poor, isolated region um, in the northeastern Spanish frontier into a bustling cotton economy based on slave labor. Uh, Texas goes from, in 1821, about 3,000 Spanish speaking folks in Texas, people of European descent. The Comanches still dominate this region. There are other Indian groups as well. So 1821, a few slaves, not very many, a handful of slaves. By 1840, just 4 decades later, the population of Texas has grown to almost 600,000. And of that population, almost 200,000 are slaves. So in 4 decades, Texas just accelerates, its population accelerates, it just goes nuts. And Torges wonders why this is. And his whole argument is very, very simple. That what you had is the cotton growing regions of the Gulf, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, great fortunes were being made in the production of cotton. Cotton was a huge deal. As I think I say in one of the podcasts today, think of cotton as kind of the oil of the time, and think of the Gulf Coast region as kind of the Middle East, right? Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the other very oil-rich regions of that part of the world, and how significant that region is geopolitically because of that. So what happens is that cotton growers who are using slave labor, it goes hand in hand. The cotton South, the slave South, basically comes into Texas, or as one of the chapters that Torget has, Texas becomes like Mississippi between 1800 and 1850. And what Torget wants to do is he wants to trace that transformation. And he's also interested in the arguments in Mexico itself about the question of slavery. Remember, Texas is part of Mexico from 1821 until 1836. And once Mexico became an independent nation, it almost immediately abolished slavery. It abolished slavery in 1829. And so there were big, significant questions and fights within what is now Mexico. Of course, Texas was part of Mexico at this time. But within Mexico City and then Saltillo, which was the capital of Mexican Texas, over the future of slavery. And this is one of the really original aspects of the Torget book, the discussion in Mexico itself, in central Mexico, about the future of slavery in its northeastern territory, which is what we call Texas. So Torget, the first chapter that you're reading, he reviews some of the stuff that you've already read about, the Comanche Treaty of 1785, very, very significant. The suppression of the Comanches by the suppression of the Apaches by the Comanche and the Spanish. I asked a question about this last week. Remember, after 1705, the Comanche and the Spanish team up and suppress the Comanche. They don't completely wipe the Apache out. I'm just like not making any sense at all, am I? The Spanish and the Comanche get together, suppress the Apache. The Apache don't go out of existence. They're not run into extinction. In my own research, I've actually found records of Apache stealing cattle along the Frio River as late as the early 1870s. But the Apache certainly are not as dangerous to San Antonio after the middle of the 1780s as they were before. So, what Torget is setting up in the first chapter is just what a mess Spanish Texas is on the eve of independence as Texas transitions from Spain to Mexican sovereignty. He talks about the floods. He talks about disease. He talks about the Indian threat. He talks about something that I talk about in my podcast today, and that's Texas's role in the revolution against Spain, the Mexican Revolution. Very, very bloody incident. The bloodiest incident in Texas history comes not with the Alamo or the Texas Revolution. It comes in the 1814 at the Battle of Medina, where 1,000 soldiers are killed, probably massacred. Then you have a massacre in San Antonio in Nacogdoches. So the first massacre in San Antonio was not in 1836 at the Alamo. It was actually 20 years earlier. So what Torget is doing in this first chapter is setting the stage for the Mexican period. What a mess Spanish Texas is. It's just barely hanging on. San Antonio is really the main, uh, uh, I wouldn't even call it a city. I'd call it a community in Spanish Texas. And so, and he's also trying to set the context for why the Spanish would allow in Moses Austin, Stephen F. Austin's son, because they're desperate. Again, the big population, the big problem is they just have not been able to populate this region. So in a desperation move, they let in Moses Austin, hoping that they can, that Americans will come into Spanish Texas and they'll become Spanish. It doesn't happen, obviously. So it's a desperation move, but the Spanish and later the Mexicans, they have very few cards to play when it comes to Texas. Very few cards to play. The same old problems are cropping up again. It's too far removed from Mexico City, which is the population center of Spanish and the Spanish period and the Mexican period. It's a long way to Mexico City even today. It's suffering from disease, it's suffering from Indian attacks. But what's going to transform the Texas economy? And I'm not celebrating this in any sense, because the labor force that transforms it is slave labor, just a nightmare, evil institution. But so what transforms ultimately Texas from a very poor marginal region is when Anglos come into Mexican Texas and then capture Texas and start growing cotton here. This also goes back to another point I want to make, the significance of 1803 when the United States becomes the neighbor of Texas. All you have to do is cross the Sabine River and you go from the United States into Spanish Texas. The Sabine River is not really that wide. And what we're seeing after 1803 is the Americans start breathing down the neck of the Spanish and then later the Mexicans. So what Torget is doing in the first chapter of this book is setting up the scene of what a mess Spanish Texas is, why they would open their doors to Anglos, what Anglos wanted out of this. Now, I know a lot of y'all will want to know what you need to know, that sounds like a dumb song, will want to know what you need to know. You'll want to know what's on the quiz, right? Everybody wants to know what's on the test. So what I'll do is later today, or I'll send out a list of names from the Torget book that I feel comfortable testing you on. And I'll test you on those or be responsible for those. The other names you're not going to be responsible for, and I won't bog you down with a million, just the highlights. And that way you can kind of read it with maybe it'll make it slightly more enjoyable if you know what you're being tested on and what you're not being tested on.